What happened to Sweden?
Just a few years ago, Sweden was the dream of many Europeans. But today, life in that country looks very different. In 2015 alone, Sweden took in more than 163,000 migrants. The then Prime Minister Stefan Löfven assured the public that Sweden would build bridges, not walls. Yet, in 2025, Sweden has decided to shed its image as a country open to all and has shifted to a more radical approach. The government is lowering the age of criminal responsibility from 15 to 14. They also expand juvenile prisons and even declare to ask for military assistance to support police with gang violence. Already, back in 2017, opinion polls showed growing frustration. More than half of Swedes believed terrorists and criminals had entered the country by posing as refugees. It was the first signal that social trust was beginning to crack. Back in 2010, the number of homicides through shootings in Sweden was in single digits. By 2022, there were already 63 incidents. That made statistics in Sweden comparable with countries like Albania. The most intriguing of all are the new rules offering migrants money to leave the country.
Take the money and leave, please. The Swedish government is offering to pay immigrants $34,000 if they go back to their home country. That amount is 35 times higher than the existing grant, which has been in place since 1984.
Even up to $34,000. A program that would have seemed absurd a few years ago is now a real state strategy, which raises the question, why did Sweden undergo such a paradigm shift? The turning point in Swedish politics came in 2022 with the rise to power of Ulf Kristersson, the leader of the moderate party coalition. His government rests on support from the Sweden Democrats, a party that to this day could be labeled extreme. Their hard line on migration became the price of keeping power. It is actually kind of a revolution, from a country open to every refugee to a selective state that chooses whom it needs. In practice, that means the end of open-door policy and the start of strict criteria. This includes tighter family reunification rules, longer waits for citizenship, and a language requirement. Those seeking asylum must meet tougher conditions, and those aspiring to citizenship will wait at least 8 years and prove an honest life, which means years of working, paying taxes, and obeying the law. The statistics are surely worth taking a look at. In 2015, Sweden admitted a record 163,000 refugees. That might not sound like much at first glance, but it's significant when you consider that Sweden's population is only around 10.5 million. These figures have been declining slightly, but if the newly introduced policies work as intended, they're expected to fall sharply in the coming years, perhaps to their lowest levels in decades. Even before the 2022 election, over 60% of citizens named migration and crime as the country's top challenges. That public pressure forced a political pivot and signaled that Sweden's era of mass migration had ended. You could also observe that both ordinary citizens and political elites acknowledged their mistakes. Even the center-left, following Denmark's Social Democrats, adopted tougher language on migration. And that's the best evidence that the entire political spectrum shifted rightward. The Sweden Democrats, once marginal, now wield real influence, and their hardline narrative sets the course. But to fully regain control, the government first had to douse what burned hottest: an organized crime. Not long ago, Sweden was a byword for safety with some of Europe's lowest crime rates. Today, especially in big cities, it is very different. To combat this shift, the first step was to lower the age of criminal liability from 15 to 14. And the reason behind this change is actually quite shocking. Teenagers are often being recruited into gangs as cannon fodder. Police reports show that in many cases, contract killings are carried out by 15-year-old boys.
11, 12-year-old people kill each other. People pay 100,000 for one murder, and it's a kid that does it. 15 years, 14 years, you get like 100,000 there, 200,000 there.
Kids, who a few years earlier would have been kicking a ball in the yard, now carry guns and execute hits for gang bosses. Another legal change related to the same issue is the expansion of special prisons for offenders aged 15 to 17. The goal is no longer just rehabilitation, but isolation. It's meant to cut young people off from mafia structures increasingly controlling entire districts. The government also announced special courts for gang crime to act faster and tougher than existing institutions. And there's more. In some cities, so-called security zones were introduced, areas with significantly higher levels of unemployment and crime compared to the rest of the country.
There's been a dramatic increase in so-called no-go zones across the country. The number of what Swedish officials call vulnerable areas has now reached 61.
In 2022, Sweden recorded 391 shootings, leaving 62 people dead. That's one of the highest rates in the European Union. Numbers more reminiscent of Latin America than of cool and quiet Scandinavia. The fact that the statistics have reached such levels is shocking in itself. A Nordic country long seen as one of the world's calmest has witnessed such a sharp rise in gun violence.
Det jag har fått till mig nu på morgonen då, det är att vi har en kollega då som har blivit beskjuten och sedermera då avlidit utav sina skador. Vad jag förstår så var de ute på sin vanliga så att säga, tjänst i linjen, ute och pratar med folk och är folk så att säga, behjälpliga med olika frågor.
Yet even the toughest laws won't fix a system that's overloaded, and when traditional tools prove insufficient, you have to look elsewhere for solutions. Starting in 2026, Sweden is launching a program offering up to $34,000 to any migrant who chooses to return to their country of origin. Similar schemes existed before, but the payout was symbolic. At the earlier offer of about $1,000, only a dozen or so people per year took it up. Now the government hopes the high sum will be a real incentive and that thousands will leave voluntarily. It's estimated that keeping one illegal migrant costs the state up to 300,000 Swedish kronor per year. That's about $32,000 and more than the one-off payout to depart. But critics rightly argue that the system is wide open to abuse. You can come to Sweden, receive benefits and free services, and then walk away with $34,000 to return home. Headlines declare that Sweden pays to get rid of immigrants, but comparisons with neighboring countries offer an interesting perspective. In Germany or Denmark, voluntary return payouts rarely exceed $3,000, a figure far lower than Sweden's. It seems the Swedes are trying everything, even ideas of questionable effectiveness, in a desperate attempt to fix problems of their own making.
You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden! Who would believe this? Sweden! They took in large numbers, they're having problems like they never thought possible.
But in order to fully grasp today's policy, we have to go back to 2015. That's when Sweden, along with much of Europe, opened its doors on an unprecedented scale. Swedes took in 163,000 refugees in a single year, an extraordinarily high number relative to the country's population. At first, there was enthusiasm and faith that such a wealthy state could integrate everyone. The then Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, said his Europe builds bridges, not walls.
Mitt Europa bygger inte murar. Vi hjälps åt när nöden är stor.
Sa jag att jag tycker vi ska skämmas och sätta diskutera om vi kan ta emot 20 000 kvotflyktingar. Vi tycker att vi borde öka det till ungefär 100 000 kan Europa, EU:s medlemsländer absolut stå för.
Very quickly, it became clear that even such a wealthy system couldn't bear the strain. Housing and social benefits alone cost the budget billions of kronor. In 2016, spending on asylum and integration topped 70 billion Swedish kronor. In many major cities, districts emerged that even the authorities would later label as no-go zones. Areas like Rinkeby near Stockholm or Rosengård in Malmö, for example. In Rinkeby, more than 70% of residents now have foreign backgrounds. Schools in such neighborhoods have reported that over half of their students do not speak Swedish at home, making standard education practically pointless. That's where many gangs were born, and unfortunately, that's where children ended up in mafia structures instead of classrooms. Here's another alarming statistic. In 2017 alone, Sweden experienced over 150 grenade attacks, something that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. It was the first time a majority of Swedes acknowledged that integration had failed. What was meant as a humanitarian project became one of the gravest internal crises of the post-war era. But one question remains: isn't it already too late? Sure. The government can pass new laws, lower the age of criminal responsibility, and even deploy military troops to the streets. But the truth is, there's no guarantee that the consequences of migration policy from a decade ago can ever be reversed. Let me explain. Let's look at the deportations. According to 2022 government data, about 12,000 orders to leave the country were issued, but fewer than half were actually carried out. Each year, only a few thousand people with deportation orders actually return. The main obstacles include missing documentation, lack of cooperation from their home countries, and migrants simply vanishing into the gray zone. The rest remain in Sweden, often without the right to work and beyond real state control. It's not hard to imagine that many people in such a scenario could fall into the hands of gangs that exploit their desperation. And then there's demography. Already, roughly 1 in 5 residents in Sweden has a migration background. In Stockholm and Malmö, the share reaches 35%. If current trends hold, then by 2050, people with migrant roots could make up close to 1/3 of the population. Birth statistics show this isn't a blip. Foreign-born women, on average, have higher fertility rates than native Swedes. Also, even the second generation remains a challenge. Government studies indicate that even children of migrants born in Sweden appear in police statistics more often than native-born Swedes. School segregation only makes the problem worse. Like I said earlier, in some districts, more than half of the students don't speak Swedish as their first language, which hinders education and deepens divides. As the native population ages, the burden of sustaining the welfare state will increasingly fall on groups that themselves are more often associated with public assistance. And all of that raises serious questions about the future of the Swedish model. It's hard not to compare Sweden to its neighbors. Denmark has pursued a strict migration policy for years. In 2018, it even adopted programs like a ghetto plan in order to dismantle immigrant enclaves. Thanks to that and many similar efforts, Denmark hasn't experienced so many shootings, and even social tensions remain far lower than just across the bridge in Malmö. In 2022, Denmark recorded only a dozen or so deaths from gun violence, and Sweden had over 60. Sweden now stands as a warning. It shows how a careless open-door policy can undermine the stability and prosperity built over generations. Which brings us to the final question. Will the rest of Europe follow Sweden's lead and begin making changes now, or wake up only when it's already too late? You can learn more about it in the video currently displayed on your screen.